So how does sort of parenting fit in relation to the kinds of psychosocial issues, particularly that children might have? I just thought I'd give you some examples and flesh out some of the sort of complexities that can arise here. First of all, some really interesting research that's just come out about children's expression of shame and guilt. So this is when children express these emotions, shame and guilt. You can experience shame and guilt when you've got a sense of self. So often around about the sort of toddler phase, by about 2 years old, infants or children will start to have this experience. Guilt is when you tend to feel bad because of something that's happened or that you've done that involves somebody else. Shame is something you tend to feel when it's something you've done. Okay, both emotions are important emotions. Both probably have positive effects. Okay, and are important, but they can also have negative effects when they get overwrought. So really high levels of guilt and shame ultimately can be implicated in things like depression. So the way children develop guilt and shame is a very interesting thing to be looking at. And here's something that was found by this particular piece of research, and I'll fix the reference up when I give you the slides. But this is what they found. They found that fathers, but not mothers, depression and permissive parenting was associated with higher levels of shame and guilt. So what we're doing now as researchers, including fathers more in the picture, more and more we're discovering different effects of fathering and mothering. And here's an example of where there might be a different effect. When dad is more permissive, or when his depression is getting in the way of him interacting with children, and particularly interacting with them when they behave inappropriately, then that is what seems to be associated with higher levels of shame and guilt. And there are some interesting theories around why this might be going on. One theory is that if children are not kind of confronted with misbehaviour, if they're not given early experiences learning to deal with times when they act in an inappropriate way, they don't get the opportunity to sort of build this part of themselves into their sense of themselves. All right? If you don't get that experience, right, of learning that you've done something wrong and that you might feel bad about that, but then ultimately you can be okay with it, all right, if you don't get that experience, what happens when you start to experience it out of the blue is it has a bigger impact on you. So the permissiveness, which is dad not interacting, not intervening when he should, what's happening there is a child is losing the opportunity to understand that their behaviour was inappropriate at that point and losing the opportunity to learn how to cope with that emotionally. Really interesting idea. One area that's also been really important in understanding the impact of parenting is in children's anxiety. And here's some really interesting findings. Children of parents with anxiety disorders are 2 to 7 times more likely to have an anxiety disorder compared with children from families in which neither parent has an anxiety disorder. So what are we potentially looking at here? We're potentially looking at a whole range of things, genetics as well as environment. Okay, here's another one. 65% of children of parents with anxiety disorders meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. 65% of children with parents with anxiety disorders. So anxiety is catchy, right? Anxiety disorders can be passed down in families. Anxiety disorders are catchy. And it seems like in this particular instance, genetics is important. Like you can inherit something from your genes that can predispose you towards anxiety, but it turns out the environment appears to be even more important. And there's been a series of studies that have shown how this happens, particularly the family environment and particularly parent-child interaction. This is work by Mark DeRosnay. Mark DeRosnay, what he found was he did this study where they had infants who were, how old were they? They were between 12 and 14 months. And what they did was they did this experiment. They got the infant's mother, they had 2 situations. One in which they got the infant mother to just respond normally to a stranger. So just as you would normally respond to the stranger, you do that, allow the infant to watch that. Then they taught the mother how to respond to the stranger in an anxious way. So in an anxious, avoidant way. And then they observed the infant's behaviour having watched the 2 models, right? So you can imagine this is randomly allocated, children are randomly allocated. And what they found, which is something you might expect, is that when infants were exposed to the anxious behaviour of their parent, they were more avoidant and more anxious in the face of the stranger. When the mother, when she projected confidence in her interaction with the stranger, they were much less anxious. So here what the infant is doing is socially referencing, watching the behaviour of the parent and learning that, in fact, in one case learning that the stranger is not somebody to be feared, right? And they're more okay about that, but in another circumstances, getting cues that the stranger is somebody to be feared and therefore being more anxious. A similar kind of role for parenting was also found in this very interesting study done by Barrett and colleagues. This is Australian work. And what they did was they got these middle years children to work with the investigators. They asked them about socially challenging situations, and they asked the kids to come up with solutions to those socially challenging situations. And then part of the study was that the children went and spoke to their parents afterwards. They went and spoke to their parents, and they had to tell their parents about their solution and talk to their parent about what they were planning to do and so on. And here's what they found. They were all anxious kids. And here's what they found. They found that when an anxious child spoke to their parent, they came out even more anxious, right? They came out even more avoidant. Because what the anxious parents tended to do was to talk to them in ways that increased their worry. Things like, could you really do that, do you think? Don't you think you really should ask a teacher about that? Those kinds of questions. So the conversation with the parent increased the amount of child's worry, increased the amount of child's anxiety, didn't decrease it. All right? So here's a sort of a direct parenting mechanism that's increasing anxiety, and it probably looks like something like this. We start with an anxious parent who already has an interpretation bias, more likely to see things as being threatening, more likely to see things as being dangerous. Given an ambiguous scenario, the anxious person tends to go, that's a worry, all right? Then what they do is they convey a sense of heightened threat, all right? Naturally, if you think it's a worry, you convey that. You can't help it. You convey it to the child who then feels more anxious. But not only feels more anxious, learns to look at the world in that way, all right? Ensuring that they continue to be anxious. But there's another scenario too. You might have heard people talk about overprotective parenting and so on, and there's a little bit of truth to this. The anxious parent tends to be more controlling, all right? Tends to limit the child's exposure to life experiences, and what that does is it tends to reduce the child's sense of competence, like their confidence in dealing with life situations, which in turn makes them more anxious. So there are at least two possible mechanisms that might be going on here. But what we're seeing with anxiety in parents and children is that it operates a bit like a ratchet, all right? So when you're anxious as a parent, then what happens is that, and your child's anxious, you tend to kind of feed on each other, and it operates like a ratchet, ratcheting up the anxiety, all right? Now, I just want to reiterate that this has all come about because people have been really interested in the cause. What's causing what? Is it the parent-child interaction causing the anxiety, or is the child's anxiety causing the parent's behaviour? And the answer is both. If you have an anxious child, what does it encourage you to do? To be protective, right? So it's a natural process, all right? And that's how the ratchet works. Anxiety, increasing anxiety in the parent, becoming more protective, and the child then not learning how to deal with their world in less anxious ways. Here's some, also again, very new research now looking at the couple's effect on anxiety in children. So how does a couple's relationship impact on children? Well, it turns out there is a relationship between undermining co-parenting and children's fearfulness. So undermining co-parenting is where a member of the couple kind of tends to be critical and judgmental and tend not to support another parent's decisions, doesn't back them up, all right? That's what we think of as undermining co-parenting. And the undermining co-parenting seems to be related directly to children's fearfulness, and there are probably a couple of reasons. One is because it potentially reduces a sense of emotional safety, all right? So when your parents are not backing each other up, not supporting each other, that makes you feel more anxious. But there's also this other possibility that children's fearfulness creates a strain on the relationship. So when a child is already anxious, it can be quite demanding and challenging to deal with that. I mean, day after day, if your child is having a massive kind of temper tantrum and being really upset about being left at childcare, that really puts pressure on you. And you can see couples begin to have conflict and disagreements about should we be pushing him, should we be protecting him, and so on. And you'll get one member of the couple being more potentially on the nurturing, no, we've got to protect him for this, and the other maybe more pushing, all right? And that can be a problem. That kind of undermining of co-parenting can be a problem. It tends to increase or exacerbate children's fearfulness. But here's what they learned about parental anxiety. The way parental anxiety tended to be related to children's fearfulness is by increasing undermining co-parenting. So when a parent was more anxious already and getting anxious, they found it really hard to back up their partner, all right? Their anxiety was driving them forward and driving them into more and more disagreement with their parents. So the parent anxiety seemed to be related to more the couple relationship rather than directly to the children's fearfulness. Again, really interesting, isn't it? This need for us to think more about what's going on with the couple. Similar kind of work has been done with depression. So we know there's a relationship between maternal depression and internalising problems. All right, so this is what anxiety and so on, those internalising difficulties. There is a direct relationship between those two things, but it tends to be moderated by the amount of rejection and punishment in the parent-child interaction. Now, when I say moderated, what moderated means, it means it's a factor that can exacerbate or magnify or potentially minimise the effect of something, all right? So maternal depression will have an impact on children, but it'll have a bigger impact if there's a high degree of negative parent-child interaction going on, negative in terms of rejection and punishment. But in relation to externalising problems, it's a different connection, all right? It's a different connection. And what it turns out is that it's not direct, it's in fact mediated. So where maternal depression involves more hostile or aggressive negative behaviour, then it's much more likely to be involved in, much more likely to result in externalising behaviours, problems, okay? So where depression is not associated with hostile irritability or negativity, then children are not necessarily at greater risk of developing behavioural problems. And this is, again, really important in terms of understanding how we work with depressed parents, mothers and fathers, is that we don't conclude because you're depressed you're behaving in a particular way. Just keep in mind that depression can be kind of exhibited in lots of ways. But there are groups of parents who can be quite significantly depressed but not let that or somehow are able to accommodate that and not be negative in their interactions with children. They're able to protect their children from their own depression, which is an amazing thing. When you know anything about depression, that's an amazing thing to be able to do. But what it also suggests is that there could be a really important role of parenting work. The parenting work may not be able to resolve the depression work, but it may be able to resolve some of depression issues, but it may be able to resolve some of these issues around how the mother is interacting with the child. We're going to have a break in a second and sort of do an exercise, but I just want to cover a little bit more ground before we do that. There's some really interesting work around the role of work and family now. How does work impact on parents and parenting? And again, it's turning out to be a more complex picture than what we thought. It's really interesting with work because we tend to start from the assumption that work is bad. You know, that work is bad for families, particularly mother's work, and it's really an unfounded assumption. There's actually lots of positives for children and families when both men and women work. Working is not necessarily a negative. Where we might start to get concerned, though, is about work-family conflict. So particularly where parents are working in environments which are not very flexible, not conducive to more flexible arrangements, that can give rise to work-family conflict. And there is a link between work-family conflict and children's behaviour problems. But it's a mediated link, all right? That means the way it affects children is through couple relationship quality and through the parent-child relationship quality. So it is actually possible for somebody to experience work-family conflict and the children not to be exposed to negative consequences from that if it doesn't result in couple relationship quality and parent-child relationship quality. Now, so this is the difference between moderators and mediators. All right? A moderator is something that can exacerbate the effect of some factor. A mediator is something that determines whether or not it will have that effect. So, and understanding that is a good thing to keep in mind when you're sort of looking at literature around parenting and parent-child relationships. In this case, if work-family conflict does not result in one of those two things, then we wouldn't expect child behavioural problems. But what it also suggests is parenting support in the instance of work-family conflict could be protective. All right, it could help prevent longer-term difficulties that children might experience.